All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webcast today entitled How to Avoid Recovery Failures, presented by Boomerang Solutions Group and Quorum. My name is Darren Pendergraft, and I'll be your host this morning. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of housekeeping information about the webcast. All lines will be muted, but because of the way we're going to handle the webcast this morning, we do want you to type your questions into the chat widget, and we'll answer them as they come in and as we can get to them. We're going to cover a variety of topics this morning, ranging from network issues to Active Directory and Exchange. And so as we're talking and as we're going through some of the things we want you to think about, if questions come up, please type them in. I'll try to monitor the questions and we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. But if not, I've reserved some time at the end of the webcast for us to pick up any questions we missed and answer them. Now, if you've got a more detailed question and it looks like it's going to take a few minutes or a longer explanation, what we're going to do is I'll get these over to the guys and we'll get you an email response to get you all the information you need to answer your question adequately. I am recording the webcast and it will be available as a download after the end of the webcast. So if you're interested in sharing the webcast with a colleague, please visit the Quorum YouTube channel and you'll be able to send a link to your colleagues and share the content with them. All right. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers today. Panos Sawanjan is an expert on business continuity, disaster recovery, storage, application servers, and networks. And he holds certifications in virtualization, VoIP, and various other technologies. Panos is a veteran. He's been in technology for nearly 2 decades, and he currently leads as Vice President of Field Engineering at Boomerang Solutions Group. So Panos, welcome to the call today.
Thank you. Good to be with everybody. Thank you for joining.
Sorry about that. All right, Jason Snook, Solutions Architect at Quorum, where he's primarily responsible for designing backup and recovery solutions, custom fit for customer environments. But he's also an experienced IT admin with over 15 years in industry before he came over and started working with the vendor community, where he was focused on network engineering, security engineering, and system administration. Jason, thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Darren. Glad to be here. Panos, nice to share the screen with you today. Looking forward to the next 30, 45 minutes. Likewise. Thank you, Jason.
All right, guys. Before we get started talking about how to avoid recovery failures, right? And so the subtext here is like, what could possibly go wrong? I wanted to start with some assumptions. So I wanted to let the audience know that what we're not going to do today is a basic primer on backup and recovery. We're going to make some assumptions that you have some sort of backup solution in place. And more importantly, we're going to assume that you have a backup solution in place and that it actually works, right? So we all have, in most cases, some sort of backup system, whether it's backing up to tape, backing up to disk, whether you're using cloud service, whether you're using Quorum, whether you're using someone else. You got to have that in place. That's the fundamentals, right? More importantly, you also have to have a recovery plan and some sort of run book and some sort of process in place to take that backed up data and recover it and bring a server back to life. We're going to assume that you have a backup solution. We're going to assume that you have a recovery solution. We're going to assume that all of that stuff actually works. And this webcast is going to take the next step, which is, what if you have a working backup and recovery system and you go to recover a server or an application or some data and something goes wrong, right? What we want to talk about today is what could possibly go wrong during the recovery. And this is really going to focus on all those things in your environment, all those complexities in your environment that could cause a recovery to not work. Even though you've got a system in place, even though you've got a plan laid out, what are all the complexities that you need to be thinking about and testing for and trying before you actually come into a recovery situation? And this webcast really came out of a very interesting customer briefing that Panos and Jason and I did, where customers said, we have products in place, but there are just funny things about our environment that cause us problems, or there's funny things about our management, or we're not allowed to delete any emails or any data or things like that. And that started us discussing all the things that could possibly go wrong while you're trying to do a recovery. We know a recovery is pretty intense and stressful anyway. And so what we want to do this morning really is kind of go over all the things you should be looking for and preparing for before you actually need to do a recovery. Now, to get started, what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite the guys to kind of split a list of definitions up, because I think as we went through this, even though I've been in the industry a long time, there were some terms getting thrown around that I hadn't actually had to deal with. So guys, I'm going to turn this list over to you, however you want to divide it up. Let's go through some of these definitions first, and then we'll get into some of the specific recovery failures that we want to talk about today. So, so who wants to get started?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
You want to take the first one?
Absolutely, yeah.
Don't need to volunteer you. Good.
No worries. So yeah, I mean, these are pretty common backup recovery terms: RTO, RPO. So RTO, break it down, it's recovery time objective. It is your tolerance for how quickly do you need to be back up and running. So a lot of people will say my RTO, meaning if a server goes down, I'm okay with it being, taking, let's say, an hour. Some other people will say 5 minutes. Some people will say that's not good enough. I need to have instant failover. So RTO is a really critical number to figure out, and it doesn't have to be, global across your entire environment. You can have RTO values that are different for different servers. Now, RPO, recovery point objective. Think of it this way: RPO is how often are you looking at your server and grabbing the changes. What that means is the frequency of backups. If you're a snapshot backup company, then it's the frequency of snapshots. But more importantly, this is when you're going to your C-level guys, you're saying, hey, my RPO is how much data am I willing to actually lose, right? None of us want to lose data, but it's a fact of life. I mean, if you have an RPO of 1 hour, meaning you're going to take a snap every hour, you have a potential data loss of 59 minutes, right? So that's the way to think about RPO: is what are you comfortable with the worst case scenario, your potential data loss.
Yeah, I'll take those are good, definitely good insights. I'll take the next two, if you don't mind, Jason, just because they're somewhat cross-correlated. So you have a concept of crash consistency. So when you're talking about data loss itself, you're talking about a situation where your application server perhaps have crashed, right? Maybe you have not taken a consistent backup. So when you're talking about consistency of the data, there are methods to recover the data itself to a consistent known state. And that's the latter, which is application consistent recovery, where the application itself knows that the data has been essentially checked, has been essentially known consistent from an application friendly state, and now it's friendly to recover, versus actually recovering from a crash consistent state means I've lost something in the building. I don't know if my last backup was really good. Sometimes applications like SQL can come up just fine with crash consistent recoveries, whereas Exchange, for example, would be not as friendly with that type of scenario because of the nature of the application. We'll get into some of the nuances as to why as we go throughout this, but really important to pay attention to the difference between having an application consistent recovery backup that you can go back to versus just having a crash consistent copy. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask those here in the questions box.
Yeah, and a direct tie into application consistent recovery is how do you grab a database that's actively processing transactions? And that term typically is QSing databases. Now, on the back end, how you actually grab an application consistent backup of a database without losing any transactions or without having to stop the database. Every database out there has a different way of doing it. The SQL has a VSS writer built in. Exchange and Exchange DAG members also have a specific volume shadow copy writer that will allow you to grab a snapshot without losing transactions or halting the incoming transaction list. So other databases like Oracle, they have their own way. MySQL, maybe not so much. I'm not sure if they've changed it, but it is really important to understand how you are going to achieve that application consistent recovery based on the database that you built your applications on. So, I always encourage people to look this term up specifically for their application and make sure there's a way to do it. I mean, the historical way that we've done this is we'd stop the service, snap the server, and then start the service back up. And still that happens today, but we're evolving out of that. We're able to actually grab a snapshot during the middle of the day without losing transactions.
Yep, that's a great definition of that. Planned and unplanned failover. So it's somewhat evident in the title of this specific definition, but when you're talking about failing over your applications or data, you're assuming, one, you have a place to fail it over to or to recover it. It could be a bare metal, it could be a local target, or it could be in the cloud, it could be anywhere. But you have two scenarios primarily that usually occur which prompt the need to actually fail over. And one is you have a planned event where maybe it's maintenance or some type of mitigative approach to actually cutting over. You have a reason, a very deliberate fashion to cut over and very deliberate reasons to do so. But then you have the unplanned, what do we do? Building is down or main data center, network's down, something catastrophic to the level of we have to actually execute on a recovery plan to cut over and access our systems.
Yeah, and then finally Open System Interconnect. This is something that a lot of people on the phone had to memorize during your certification process, certification classes. I know me personally, I was taking an MCSE course way back in the 90s, and I had to remember that all pizza seems to need double pepperoni, and that's how I got through my classes. So you've got 7 layers. It's really important to understand that when you're talking about recovery, you're going to touch quite a few layers. So it's really important to know not only from the physical layer, but all the way up to the application layer, what is actually required to bring a system back up and get users back online again. I mean, it could be having to make a physical change, reroute power, reroute the core switch, or it could be something as simple as repointing an application server to a recovery database, right? So there's really important, we're going to get into this, but it's really important to understand all the layers of your environment and then test again, and then we'll write down your workflow afterwards that will show you where to go, how to actually recover specific applications.
All right, perfect. Okay, so thanks for getting those going, guys. And just a quick point of clarification as I was listening to you sort of explaining, questing the database really is causing it to come to a neat, clean pause or stop, right? And so that would be in sort of a planned failover sort of situation. Unplanned means something crashed, and so really there's no opportunity to quiesce it. But it's important to understand the difference and to know what happened when the crash occurred so that you know how to recover. So thanks for those definitions. Okay, so let's get on to kind of the first problem area. And this one kind of cracked me up because as I was talking to customers, they said, we've got $1 million applications, we've got retail applications, we've got HR systems, we've got CRM, we've got all these big, sophisticated, complex environments that we run in production. But the one that always gets me in trouble whenever there's any kind of hiccups is Exchange. So I definitely wanted to start off with Exchange. It definitely seems to be a bit of a problem area for a lot of our customers. And so some of the things that came up from talking to our support team and talking to some of the field engineers, you can see on the left here. So guys, I'm going to hand the list over to you. Again, tackle it however you want, divide it up, and let's get going through some of the Exchange problem areas.
Yeah, no problem. I'll take the first one here. In terms of Exchange, you have object level recovery. So Exchange itself is a giant flat file database from a traditional sense of file architecture. And when you're talking about being able to drill down into that database, that's where you're having to use a tool that can actually read from what's called the Exchange database, the EDB file. And that mailbox server holds the actual EDB file. So you have to have this presumption that the EDB is accessible. And if you're doing it from a backup, you're really not touching production. We always recommend that you're going to a successful known backup. A lot of times you have to do object level recovery where users accidentally deleted files or legal or some other reason, but you have a tool, we're assuming you have a tool that can actually drill down and read into the Exchange database and recover things like individual mail messages or calendar items, in particular Outlook calendar items that you need to maybe pull back or reference that this person was at this event on this date, for example. But that object level recovery is the ability to get into the actual database. Where things tend to go awry with that is the obvious points. The database that they're recovering is either corrupt or inaccessible, or the account they're using doesn't have the proper permissions to access the actual individual mail items, or the actual mail items maybe exist in a prior backup or weren't captured within the time frame that you're trying to recover to. So there are various steps that you want to assess when it comes to object level. You may have to go back a backup before. You may have to request specific access. These are the common problem areas when you're talking about Exchange, but you want to make sure you have the right licensing and the right tool to be able to do that. Dynamic DNS, I'll take that one as well. Dynamic DNS is an assumption that you have the ability to update the domain name server records for Exchange. So if something goes wrong in production, you want to be able to have the capability to, if there's a variation or a change into the environment you're trying to recover to, you have that variation encompassed or actually accounted for in your recovery plans and procedures. So that could be updating specific names, specific server addresses even. So you want to make sure that you have the capability to know that any system you're recovering to is accounted for from an actual DNS standpoint. A lot of times we see challenges and problems happen in that specific region where they're trying to update records. It's the wrong record being updated for the wrong server. They may have a DAG group in place, and we'll explain DAG in just a moment. But there may be one component that needs readdressing and another component that's fine, and they're just not talking because of that. So you're dealing usually with Exchange, if it's on-prem Exchange versus, anything else in the cloud, that's a completely different picture. But when you're talking about on-prem in particular, you have to make sure that if you're recovering to another site or another location, you keep this in the forefront in terms of DNS protection and capabilities.
Yeah, hey, Panos, I have a question for you. Yeah, Panos, I kind of have a question for you. So when you guys are setting up a dynamic DNS setup for a customer, let's say they've got either multiple sites or they've got a recovery vendor that's holding a copy of their Exchange DAG, do you walk them through and do you help them with the weighting of MX records and choosing a dynamic DNS partner? How far along the path do you guys take customers?
Well, it really depends on where the customer's at. If the customer has no knowledge of this, and just with anything, if you're trying to do this type of protection or recovery, if you're not familiar with doing these things, you want to make sure that you bring in an outside vendor or an outside expert that really knows it, that knows this space very well and knows exactly how to recover Exchange. In particular, Exchange is a very finicky application to recover. And I don't want to use that term loosely. It is very challenging to recover Exchange in some cases if you're not doing the right things or have the right pieces in place. If a customer, let's say they don't know much in terms of what to do and how to do it, we'll engage with them and help them from the beginning, from the very beginning stages, all the way to being able to, quote unquote, light up a footprint on the other side or in a failover scenario. We'll take them through all the steps from start to finish, essentially. There are some cases, though, that customers have taken on some of these steps and they're maybe midway and they're having some challenges and they just can't get over the next area or the next hump, if you will. We will jump in and help them there as well. But a lot of times you want to make sure that you have the best practices in place before you start actually going in and recovering environments first and foremost. You want to have expert advice there as well.
Yeah, no, that's great to know. So one thing that we see on our side, us being the backup and recovery vendor, is customers will snap their Exchange servers, they'll snap their DAG servers, and they'll move them. They'll basically put them somewhere else as a secondary or third copy, and then it comes time to test it, and we'll uncover issues with MX records, because I mean MX is tied directly to your local DNS server, which is probably an AD server. So we then will uncover issues with the AD structure, which we can go into later. But one of the things is these dependent systems, like an Exchange DAG, depend heavily, obviously, on internal DNS and internal AD servers and physical role holders and all that. And one challenge that we see is that, hey, we're able to, we can successfully QS an Exchange server and put it somewhere else, so we've got a warm copy of it to fire up at any time. But we can fire it up, and we can fire up the dependent AD servers, but we'll then uncover some other little hidden gems with the AD structure that completely prevents us from being able to completely recover an Exchange site. So again, this is something that when we're working with customers who have turned up our solution and have copied everything from site A to site B, we then start testing, and testing will uncover areas that they need to address in their own environment.
Yeah, there's always something that you uncover after you test. And, don't be surprised. You may have to test multiple times. And that's always a good thing. Every time you uncover another issue, it's always a good thing that you've actually uncovered that issue, so you can keep moving forward.
Third-party email filtering.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say third-party email filtering is another thing where, it's you're talking about another piece of application that's probably sitting in front. Barracuda is a big one that we deal with. If you're going to protect the inbound mail flow, you need to make sure that you've got your recovery system on the same network leg, right? Or you need to reroute DNS to send it to elsewhere. So when you do that, however, anything that's in line has to be in line at the recovery site as well. So you really need to make sure that whenever we've seen issues with some of the other vendors where they've prevented us from copying the inline filter and moving it somewhere else just for the DR site. And so that's been a challenge that we've had to uncover and kind of work around in the past. But if you've got something that's inline, you're going to have it inline at your DR site as well. It's going to have to be matched. It's going to have to be mirrored one for one.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Just to add to that, you mentioned Barracuda as one. I've seen, Proofpoint, Mimecast. People have spam filters that are in effect or in place. And the challenge is, one, you got to ask yourself, do you even need it in a recovery scenario? So that's first and foremost. Do I need that tool in a recovery scenario? A lot of times the answer is no, because at least if my Exchange is up and running, I have it up and running, I can communicate, and that can be like a tertiary system that I have to bring into the fold maybe later on. Can I live without it? I have to answer that question immediately. But then if I need it, if I absolutely need it, to Jason's point, you have to make sure you account for that when it comes to actually protecting that component. And the next one on there is quiesce. We talked a little bit about this a moment ago, is you have to know that the database is in a consistent known state. I mentioned Exchange is a very finicky application when you're talking about recovery, and that's because it is essentially a flat file database. So database corruption is a common scenario. Crash consistency, Exchange doesn't really play too friendly in that space. So you want to make sure that, as Jason mentioned earlier, there's been a VSS call essentially. And what happens is, if let's say Exchange is working fine in a production environment, and you use a software tool that's traditional, that doesn't back up, like any type of backup solution that's in the mix, it does a VSS call and says, hey, Exchange, can you still process your transaction? So anything that's in the queue, it'll still somewhat process it, but put it on pause, if you will, in a free state. And it'll take any writes that it has from memory and flush those writes to disk. And part of that flushing is that quiesce, is making it take those writes and essentially committing them to disk so that it knows that that specific backup is a known good state, an application-friendly state where Exchange and VSS is both come together essentially to say, yes, this data is clean, and now you can back it up. Now it's clean to back up, hence, therefore, it's now clean to recover to. That's an assumption there. There's sometimes situations that go awry where the database has incorrect permissions or not the right permissions when you're trying to recover. So those are always things to keep in mind. But making sure the database is not corrupt itself is a very key thing. And that's why QoS is such a big point to make sure in exchange it is in effect.
All right. Okay. So takeaways here are Exchange is finicky. I think you've convinced us of that. I also think the good advice here is, try a recovery, test it multiple times because you may find things on the second or third test. So, good advice, guys. Thanks for walking through those. Let's move forward and go to Microsoft Active Directory. Now, in my experience, I thought Active Directory was the finicky one, but it seems from everyone we're talking to that Active Directory is a bit more well-behaved, but there are still some trouble areas. So why don't you walk us through some of the things here that we have that cause problems?
Yeah, I can. I'd like to start off with this one because FSMO roles is always one that we see all the time, and it's kind of funny if you don't know if you don't know this term, you might just want to quickly Google it and look it up. But it's always one that's the last minute gotcha when you're trying to recover. And Active Directory has multiple roles that are maintained. So a lot of times these roles are essentially packed into one server, and it's part of your install of Active Directory. So you don't really notice it if you're a sysadmin. You're not really playing around with this type of stuff, unless you have to get into the nitty-gritty, of course. Now you set up an Active Directory server, and this thing's running for months and months, and then you add on another one and another one and another one. And sometimes these roles, you have to move them around. And within these roles, you have essentially the schema. And I'm not going to get too much into every single one of these roles, not too nitty-gritty, but the schema essentially is what's the database, if you will, the entire structure of Active Directory down to the users, group policies, object, everything that holds those things in line, the framework, if you will. And then you have a role that maintains that. Then you also have a role that keeps in line the user accounts, another role that keeps in line the permissions, the global catalog. You have an infrastructure master role. You also have a primary domain controller, secondary domain controller, and a RID master. There's various roles that go into the FSMO category. So you want to look that term up and understand what it means. But then if you have multiple domain controllers within your environment, and let's say you lose one and need to recover it, you want to account for making sure all those roles are actually intact. That's where things usually slip, is where you have diverse and spread out Active Directory roles, and you go to recover Active Directory and you say, oh no, my catalog is there, so I should just be fine. And you think it's a domain controller and it should just come up just fine. And no, I'm missing a role. Oh, now the permissions are not correct. Or here's another one to consider is if roles have changed and you've taken a backup before those roles have changed and you try to restore to that backup, you got to keep that in mind as well, because then you have now misaligned roles. So just some things to consider. We see that a lot when you're talking about Active Directory. Schema, it's kind of an interesting thing. I somewhat spoke to it a little while ago in terms of the FSMO roles itself. It's the actual framework. So a lot of times the schema itself is not really protected properly, or not just necessarily protected properly, it's not recovered properly. You don't have the correct permissions, or you've taken a last backup copy of Active Directory and it wasn't really in a tested state. So that's a big thing to hit home on. And you'll see some recurring themes throughout this presentation and what we're showing you. It's not really a presentation. This is more or less just some value add to get out to you folks and explain, hey, these are the top areas. So you just want to make sure that you keep the schema in check. You make sure you have the right permissions, good copy of the backup. And if you have multiple domain controllers in your environment, like a primary and a backup, you should be okay if you take a copy of that. If you have more than that and you have different regions, keep in mind how these roles affect them and where those specific domain controllers sit.
Yeah, the other thing that I've seen, Panos, is global catalog servers. You know, we've in smaller customers that say have two DCs and they've got all, one DC is holding all the roles and it's also the GC. They will copy the secondary domain controller powered up in our cloud, for example, to start doing testing, and realize no one can authenticate because GC was never put on that particular domain controller. So It's one of those things to keep your eye out for, is where do you put your DC that is responsible for the actual authentication of users?
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. You want to make sure you have a good positioning for that.
All right. All right. Sounds good. All right. Moving forward, everybody's favorite, and definitely there's some complexity here when you're dealing with databases and database recovery. So guys, I don't know how you want to divide this up, but SQL Server and Oracle seem to come up quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about the gotchas when thinking about database recovery.
Yeah, I'll take it just from the point of view of being the vendor, the toolbox, I guess, of taking snaps or taking copies of these servers. The area that we constantly run into for SQL Server is not necessarily around QSing the data. That's very much a proven process. The permissions also almost come up every single time. Where we have to kind of help customers along the way for restoring SQL is interdependent systems and making sure that we get all the volumes. A lot of customers, almost everyone, for example, splits transaction log files from the MDBs, and like you should. And then whenever it comes time to back it up, they'll say, well, I need to save some space in my backup appliance, so I won't do my transaction log files. Or they won't turn on logging and let us truncate the logs after the actual backup process. So it's kind of user training and best practice for not necessarily getting a good application consistent snapshot of SQL, because SQL is one of those, such a mature database that we just don't see many issues with actually capturing the data. The other gotcha, the other error or issue that we get with the SQL Server is the amount of change can dramatically spike throughout the lifespan of your backup solution. And what I mean by that is we might see a customer that says, hey, I'm changing 0.5% per day in my SQL Server, and then all of a sudden they get through a 5% change and they can't move that delta over the wire. So that is an issue that crops up every once in a while. We like to get in front of that and make sure that customers have enough bandwidth. We like to make sure that we compress in two places to make sure we're only moving compressed and deduplicated data over the wire to accommodate those larger delta swings. So that's kind of what we see on the SQL side. On the Oracle side, man, Oracle can be, your success or failure to successfully recover an Oracle server almost entirely depends on the talent you have running your Oracle systems. I mean, if it's something that you only allow your application vendor to manage your Oracle databases, then most likely we're going to have problems restoring it because there are some gotchas in there. Things haven't been set up correctly. If you're not using Armon correctly, you're going to have some recovery issues. So Oracle is definitely, again, extremely mature, extremely resilient, enterprise grade database platform. However, it takes some knowledge to get that thing to recover correctly. So that's kind of my overall point from the vendor point of view.
And those are definitely valid points. In SQL, we've seen some interesting things. You're definitely right about the fact that it's pretty resilient. Both of these applications are very resilient. There are some little gotchas that, as Jason mentioned, if you don't really have the talent or the expertise, sometimes a DBA on staff to be able to recover and get through some of these issues, you'll a lot of times run into some error messages that pop up or that come up when you're trying to restore. I've seen error messages where you're trying to restore and it's popping up and saying that your database is in recovery or read-only mode. So you may have to go in and get a third-party tool or another tool, maybe ES-util you need to run against the database and actually check and validate the database itself is healthy. You have to check that the MDB file, the LDF file is actually intact and they match. Specifically, the timestamps between the two are very consistent. I've seen inconsistent timestamps between the two causing a mismatch in the actual data itself and the recovery of the data. Transaction log could be different than the actual database file itself. You want to really make sure that the database itself is in a healthy, good, known state before it's even being backed up. But as with anything, you may need a DBA on staff to validate that the data that you're recovering is the right set of data. and it's got the right permissions. And these are always the common gotchas, is always around, did I recover to the right point in time? And do I have the right permissions? And when I did do my backup, was it in the right state to back up the data? But yeah, these are all common points. They're pretty resilient applications, as Jason mentioned, but sometimes you run into these little gotchas we've seen too.
Okay, all right, let's move forward. Something that came up fairly often was, a variety of network issues. So I've kind of split them into DNS issues and DHCP issues. Guys, what have you seen with respect to networking issues during recovery?
Oh yeah, networking issues.
Oh my gosh,
we've seen a lot. We both can probably go on all day just about this particular topic, but we'll spare you the time and cut to the chase on the very important ones. Jason, please, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, yeah, we could spend an hour on network issues when we're talking recovery, but the one thing that crops up all the time is either host-based firewalls or in Linux world IP tables running, and just not seeing either the new IP scope of the DR side, or if they're on an MPLS network and they're sharing the same subnet, we'll see issues, just basic issues of host connectivity to one another, preventing communication because, for example, let's say the recovery virtual machine is running on the same LAN segment, but the switch ARP cache hasn't updated. I mean, these are like this is why we brought in OSI at the very beginning, because you got to understand what happens when you turn a virtual machine on that used to be located on a different port, switch port. You got to understand from the very beginning what's going to happen. And so we'll see issues where IP tables will get, screwed up. We'll see issues where the host, if they're running some sort of host firewall, will prevent access. Those are some of the most basic and most frequent ones that we come up with. Of course, you always have, challenges when you're trying to bridge connections from site A to site B, where site B was the intended kind of warm DR site. Public DNS, that's one of those things where you really have to test quite a bit to make sure you've got your records set up correctly. But those are the quick and easy ones that we hear about all the time.
Yeah, and those are the quite common ones, if you will. Actually, very similar to what we also see at Boomerang. We see a lot of times you're trying to troubleshoot, and you can spend just hours on end trying to troubleshoot the network in and of itself. So one thing I always recommend to people, you want some real advice, your best friends are going to be ping, trace route, just the basics. You're going to have to take it back to the basics a lot of times in many cases. Make sure that your routes are correct, your route tables are correct, your permissions to those routes are correct. You have the proper connections, the proper names in effect. If you have an environment where you have multiple VLANs spanning across different zones within your network, and I'm not trying to get too technical, but VLANs are like segments of your network if you're not familiar with these terms. But if you have multiple segments of your network and you have to cross different hops of those segments, and maybe you don't have permission to access those different zones, or your server itself that's issuing these specific addresses are issuing to two different places at the same time, can happen a lot of times, or it's just not working. So you're a lot of times spending time troubleshooting these various nuances of networking. But again, taking it back to the basics, making sure that you have the proper settings in place, you have the proper access and controls, use the basic tools. Fundamentals always come in of value.
Yep, without a doubt.
Excellent. Okay. And guys, just to add one little tidbit that I got from the support engineers at Quorum, they said very frequently when people do their recovery testing, this is when these issues pop up. So I've heard that theme from you guys on a couple different things. Again, try it out. Test your recovery. Don't just, spin up an instance, but instead try to do a failover. Try to stand some things up and see, as Panos said, see if you can ping the servers, see if your networking is configured correctly. So I think the takeaway here really is very frequently networks change very often, and they may change without the system administrator knowing it. They could be, hardware upgrades or other changes by the security or the networking teams. So really testing was one of the things that can show up some of these issues. And that was just one of the points that the support engineers made that they wanted to make sure we told the audience today. All right, so we touched on this a little bit. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to specifically take some time and talk about firewall and security software. I know you guys have both mentioned Barracuda and Proofpoint, but if you could, why don't you guys kind of walk us through some of the issues we see with both with firewall issues and security software and how to be thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
again,
sure. So,
to Panos' point, I mean, it's all about those basic tools to understand what is getting in the way, what is filtering. When we're talking about firewalls, a lot of times, firewalls are not just setting up a standard NAT or PAT filter, but they're actually getting into the application stream and filtering based on what it sees and making a heuristic decision. And so a lot of times they'll, firewalls, for example, what was the one that we were working with the other day? It'll come to me here in a second. This particular firewall was set to allow traffic from one zone of a network to another. However, it was monitoring the application, and it just didn't like a backup stream. It just did not like the blocks of data that looked like a VSS, volume shadow copy stream, point A to point B. So it blocked it, and it put it in its log, and it took us an hour to figure out where the block was because ping work, trace work, all that stuff. So firewalls are, incredibly important and efficient and pretty darn smart. And however, sometimes they get a little aggressive. And so knowing your firewall in and out, knowing where to search for the why traffic didn't make it from point A to point B is critically important.
yeah, and to add to that, web content filtering is very similar, but you want to keep in mind it has a very specific nature, so it's a very focused product itself. Web content filtering a lot of times, or proxying, also gets in the way in that it redirects traffic, or it takes a specific type of traffic and redirects it. So not necessarily interrupting the flow, if you will, in every case of just replication or copying the data, but sometimes accessing consoles or getting to specific ports on specific servers, like RDP gets blocked or redirected if you're doing web RDP. I don't know if you ever have to use any of those specific or any remote tools over the web. Sometimes those get blocked. So you want to keep these things in perspective. If you're recovering to an environment that has these tools in place, you want to make sure that they're actually defined. A lot of times, all these various third-party tools, they all have similar rule sets, but they do things a different way, if you will. So you just want to pay attention to how that vendor does things their way, try to understand it a little bit, and understand how it relates to the tools in your environment. Because not two products, because they're manufactured from two different vendors, you'll see different things going on. So as was mentioned, you want to test, but big thing before testing is don't test in production, of course. Everything we're talking you through here, you don't want to test it in an actual production scenario unless you have like that ability to do so, where it's not going to hurt your customers, it's not going to hurt your business, not going to cause any impact there. I've done tests in some cases. I used to work at a bank where we've done some DR failover tests many moons ago, and we did it on Columbus Day, which was a banking holiday. It was the only time that would be in effect the calm time, the calm before the storm, of actually being able to test some of these things out. So keep that in mind too.
All right.
Yeah, great stuff.
Excellent advice, guys. So a couple takeaways here. One is that a firewall could create a problem that kind of looks like a networking issue. Jason, is what I think I heard without understanding all the particulars, right? So your network is properly configured, but the firewall doesn't like certain packets and it just stops them. And so you may be chasing down what you think is some sort of network issue, and really it turns out to be the firewall.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Panos, also good advice. I think a lot of people's test environments probably don't include some of the security software because it's inside in a controlled, test network or test environment. So interesting. So definitely want to take a look at that and make sure that in the case of planned failovers, you may or may not have that security software in the mix, but unplanned, you're going to have to get them involved, right? Because that's is probably something that the management's not going to let you go without. And so, definitely getting in front of those issues, looking into how Barracuda and Proofpoint and how these things are going to work and how you're going to be able to get them set up quickly. in a production unplanned failover, I think is good advice. All right. So this takes us to kind of the point in the presentation where I'm going to remind the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in. But I'd like to ask each of our speakers now to kind of give us some final thoughts. We've talked about Exchange, AD, databases, network, firewall, and security software. So Panos, I think I'd like to start with you. Let me just have you do kind of a wrap up, maybe hit some key points that you'd like people to take away, and then Jason, I'll ask you to do the same.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks everybody for joining. Really, first and foremost, thanks for taking your time to pay attention to some of this material. I hope it's helped you, and I hope it's added value to your lives. But first and foremost, any of this stuff you're doing, you want to make sure that if you don't know the particular area, like if it's Exchange and you're not an Exchange person, engage somebody that you can ask before you actually start recovering and testing your environment. And make sure that if you do test, you're not going to hurt your bottom line. You're not going to hurt your business channels or your business units. And when you do test, make sure you're encompassing and you're thinking about all the various components that go into the mix. So you may be recovering SQL, but was there a web or an app tier that had to be part of that? Did Active Directory have to be started up first? Do you have Active Directory, DNS, and DHCP all meshed into the same server? So do you have to account for all those components at once? Is it going to be easy or is it going to be hard? Are there firewall rules that you have to account for when you're actually recovering? Are there going to be different access and security permissions that you have to worry about between, where you're going from and where you're going to? And assuming it's all happening local, do you have the ability to do this without, again, impacting production? So again, all these themes are somewhat similar, recurring themes throughout this presentation is make sure you've got all your checks and balances in place, and do make sure you test and you engage an actual vendor that knows what they're doing, that knows the specific aspects of these components. A lot of times when you get vendors in this space, you get somebody that's focused on a very one-off basis. Either it's Active Directory, or it's SQL, or it's the network, or it's the storage. It's very rare to find an actual vendor that can take everything from the business channel, what the business needs from a recovery standpoint, and take it all the way down to the application and the business unit, how to keep it operational should you have a disaster. But make sure you test, make sure you keep these things in check, and you actually engage a vendor before you do. That's my summary.
Yeah, thanks, Panos. So, my quick summary is, from the vendor point of view, the ability to accurately test your ability to recover is critically important. And so when you're looking at, if you're going down your laundry list of how do I protect my environment from any sort of outage, way up at the top of your checklist is how do they allow me to test? And so testing should be part of it should be automatic, right? You don't want to have to be doing it all the time. You want to know that your system is accurately capturing the day's changes and rolling them up into a bootable clone. But B, you want to be able to use the recovery platform at any time, whether it's local, on-prem, or at your remote site, or in someone's cloud, private or public. You want to be able to test the solution from top to bottom. So that's the one thing that I kind of learned from going from the customer side for 15 some odd years to going over to the pre-sale side on the vendor world is I learned pretty painful and important lessons that when I didn't test, I was sold a solution that just flat out didn't perform like I wanted it to. And so highly recommend that anytime you're looking at a new recovery system, find out at the very outset, find out on that first call, how do I test it? How do I verify that it's there for me if I need it? So that's probably my main takeaway.
Okay, great, Jason. Thank you for that. Questions, guys. We only have a few minutes. We do have a couple questions, and so I'd like to ask you each to take a shot at these. Jason, the first one's for you. What about recovering from the cloud? Are there any things you need to be thinking about with respect to networking? So I think you touched on this a little bit. You talked about it a little bit, but what is unique what are some of the unique things about recovering from cloud that you might need to be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. Bandwidth is a big one, right? Bandwidth, you've got to make sure that you've got enough bandwidth to either run from the cloud and connect your site or one of your sites to your cloud partner and not have too much of an impact in running performance. You want to have enough bandwidth to, if you have to do a file level restore over the wire, you want to have enough bandwidth to understand how long that will take. And then just flat out connectivity. Some vendors will allow you to bridge your LAN with the cloud, which is incredibly useful. I mean, there's all kinds of, different ways to do it. But if you can make your cloud provider reside on your own subnet, it becomes way easier to fail over and leverage that cloud resource. It almost looks like it's local, even though it's hosted somewhere completely different. So that's the big challenge for cloud connectivity and networking. Okay.
All right, sounds good. Panos, we have one for you. You mentioned some different types of clustering, Exchange, file level clustering, a few things that, could you just talk a little bit about the different types of clustering and, potentially any gotchas there, because it seems like that adds a level of complexity that, people may not be familiar with.
Yeah, clustering is always a kind of a tricky thing to get over when you're talking about recovering. You have multiple types of clustering. When you're talking about Windows world and clustering, you have a Microsoft cluster, and a lot of the customers I run into today, they're not as much using these anymore, or they're trying to move off of them. But you have the traditional Microsoft cluster, but then you could have within that a SQL cluster. Or in Exchange's world, in the newer Exchange, you have essentially a built-in what's called a DAG group, which essentially is a native type of clustering environment. Clustering is finicky sometimes, and I use the word finicky there as well, because a lot of times clustering is challenged where you have different components that go into the cluster, where you have essentially a quorum disk or a central disk that has to be paid attention to all the time, and that somewhat has to be able to be available and transition between the two systems if you're using in an active passive state. If you're using in an active cluster state, that even presents another challenging scenario where you have to account for both active clusters. So in the clustering world itself, you have essentially a concept where servers are built for a resiliency scenario, where if one server goes down, you have the other server it can route to. In the Microsoft world, you got to make sure that both servers are well intact when you're failing from. And a lot of times you're going from a cluster to actually a single node. So you may have multiple clusters in production, but you may need to go down to a single node when you're talking about your recovery scenario. So this could be taking multiple IP addresses from production for those various cluster resources, whether it's the service that watches the disk or the resource, or the service itself that is meant for the actual server. You have to make sure that you account for all that stuff in production and make sure that your recover to environment has those components and services properly mounted and addressable as well. So if it's a disk that's being clustered or an application, make sure that your recover to environment encompasses that as well. And those are really the challenges. Clustering, not so much permissions as much, more or less the data and access to the data. Very similar to networking.
Excellent. All right. Let's see. Okay. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Gentlemen, on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Great presentation, lots of good advice. And to the audience, thank you for your attendance on behalf of Boomerang Solutions Group and Quorum. We do appreciate your attendance. Everyone who registered for the webcast will be getting a follow-up email with a link to our replay. And so I'd encourage you to share this replay with any of your colleagues who you think may also benefit from the presentation. And with that, I'm going to end the webcast. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.